Are you aware of how overpowered and easy Cassiopeia is to play and even climb? In this clip, she's completely nuking Xayah, almost dealing 2k damage to her. But how is she doing that? There's no stacking, there's no scaling, Cassiopeia is dealing that damage outright. Well, that's mainly due to this setup. She has a ton of AP, and Xayah has had anti-heal applied to her. Sources of anti-heal are huge because you can bypass Cassiopeia's first spell rotation. Later, I'll also show you similar comps that capitalize on Cassiopeia's potential, and as you'll see, the setup is not difficult at all. And I'll show you exactly how to use and abuse this exclusive tech and these secret comps. But why hasn't Cassiopeia been relevant until now? Which of her traits should you invest in? And is Cassiopeia the best single target damage dealer in this entire set? But firstly, remember to subscribe. Anyway, Cassiopeia hasn't received a direct buff since patch 13.15, which went live on the 2nd of August. In fact, in the 13.17 PBE, there was going to be a buff for Cassiopeia, but that was quickly reverted because she became insanely overpowered. So clearly as a unit, Cassiopeia is adequately powerful. So why was Cassiopeia reroll so irrelevant, and why did we never see a Cassiopeia reroll comp in the entirety of set 9? Well, the issue stemmed from a former trait distribution, and the fact that if you wanted a board centered around Cassiopeia, you needed to be at least level 6 to play enough units to activate all of her traits. And many of those units in her trait trees were very disjoint from each other, which was caused by how late game some of those units were, and how some of those units just had no synergies with Cassiopeia comps. This was incredibly counterintuitive, because ideally you'd want to be level 5 so you can reroll for Cassiopeia 3 at higher odds for 1 costs. To put this into proper perspective, in this set, the vast majority of the other 1 cost units only needed level 4 to activate all of their traits. Cassiopeia was just an awful unit to reroll, as there was a stark lack of overlapping units at lower costs and levels. So even though Cassiopeia as a unit was incredibly powerful, the comps and units around her were not. But of course, the mid-set fixed this issue in 3 different ways. Firstly, Yordles were removed, which removed the chokehold they had on 1 cost reroll comps. And with Yordles removed, there became space for units like Milio and Neferi, which synergize with Cassiopeia extremely well and bolster her early game. And lastly, Noxus and Shurima have had their breakpoints reworked, which constructs a far easier route for Cassiopeia to take, as those deeper breakpoints are infinitely more achievable now. So even though Cassiopeia still technically needs 5 units minimum, once you realize that Invoker is useless for Cassiopeia, then she only needs 4 units to activate all of her relevant traits. And I'll explain why Invoker is useless for her later. Anyway, a lesson I've learned through this is that for a 1 cost unit to have many viable and available reroll comps, their minimum unit count to activate all of their traits cannot exceed 5 low cost units. So with all of that aside, let's bite into the meat of this video, which are the best Cassiopeia reroll comps. So of course you'd think that you should play a comp around Cassiopeia's traits, but actually that's not quite the case, and you usually don't play more than 3 Noxus, you never bother with vertical invokers, and the primary focus in a Cassiopeia comp should always be Shurima. But why? Well, let's look at Noxus first. The difference in AP between 3 and 5 Noxus is 19, which isn't really worth it when you consider that Swain is the only true tank in this trait, and investing deeper into Noxus can sabotage your frontline. And you can compensate for that 19 AP from other sources like Strategist, which is more beneficial to other carries you may have, like Azir. Anyway, Invoker is useless for Cassiopeia because she already has a very low mana cost ult. So with blue buff and a takedown, she will only need a single auto to cast again, in which case the mana from Invoker is completely unnecessary. In these Cassiopeia comps, Invoker is more useful to units with large mana costs, but you don't really need to worry about that until you're in the late game. Shurima is by far the best trait to invest into because the bonuses from the trait itself provide Cassiopeia with both sustain and attack speed, so she will get the single auto off faster and cast more often. And secondly, the Shurima units themselves provide substantially more damage and frontline at the same time. Units like Nasus and Azir just come online so easily, which helps this reroll comp scale well into the late game. And that leads me into the first and quintessential Cassiopeia comp that I'll show you, and that is this full Shurima board centered around Renekton 3 and Cassiopeia 3 with great utility units like Ashe and Sejuani. This is my recommended comp you play from game to game because it is the most consistent, and having Freljord means that you do not need to worry about shred items. In fact, the Freljord Storm will hit at the same time your Shurimans ascend. Now, this comp is phenomenal because you have loads of frontline whilst also having many choices of carries that you can itemize. Of course, there's Cassiopeia and Azir, but Ashe and Darius can deal a lot of damage through Vanquisher and if they're 3-starred. Although I wouldn't 3-star them because Ashe's utility doesn't scale with star level, and you can go 9 instead to either play Ryze or drop Darius to play Aatrox and Mordekaiser. Now, Ashe has Morello here for an extremely important reason, but I'll cover that more in depth in the next section. Anyway, the next comp is a slight variation of the previous one, but it also has 3-star Samira and Neferi, which at level 8 looks something like this. Now, what's great here is that Samira and Neferi have a symbiotic relationship. They're both challengers, Samira's shred helps Neferi get through the front line, and if Neferi dies, both Cassiopeia and Samira can utilize the damage from Darkened Dagger with their incredibly low mana casts. And once again in this comp, you have a lot of itemization options between carries like Neferi and Samira and tanks like Renekton, Nasus and Sejuani. And you could play Ryze at level 9 for perfect synergies and a board of 9 units that cost 99 gold. Oh, that is nice! Although, again, you could drop Darius for Mord and Aatrox, which would also give you 2 Darken. But of course, there are versions of Cassiopeia reroll without Renekton, like this version around Soraka 3 and Swain 3. Now, what's great about this board is that most of these units use Targon extremely effectively. Despite Swain 3 not being absolutely necessary, Targon and Soraka will allow a Swain 3 to heal and absorb a disgusting amount of damage. Also, even at 1-star, K'Sante provides a lot of value and Soraka can heal him as he K'Santes all over the enemy board. With this comp, I'd recommend putting Tarakan next to Swain so Swain can get multiple casts off without taking too much damage, which in turn means that Swain can just 1v9. And Redemption is particularly amazing on Swain as his HP pool increases with each cast. This itemization for Swain means that he can heal for his large HP pool, he can apply anti-heal for Cassiopeia and get through those beefy tanks, and that last tank item will allow him to have enough tank stats to match his massive HP pool. The AP from Noxus, Merlo and Sork will give Swain around 70 AP, which with the Soraka healing means that Swain can get very beefy. Now, moving on, I'll show you this Strategist version where Cassiopeia can get a ton of AP through both Noxus and Strategist. But the frontline is a bit lacking, so you may want to 3-star a tank like Swain or Nautilus, which would also buy time for Neela to scale. I personally prefer Swain 3 because Swain has more flexible itemization, but Nautilus is still a great alternative if Swain is contested. And in this board, you can give the Morello to either Swain or Misfortune. Now, to wrap it all up, I'll mention this 5 Noxus for Shurima comp. Now, this board has a lot of damage through 5 Noxus, but I find that if you're playing vertical Noxus, units like Mordekaiser and Katarina are just better carries with the other stats from Noxus. Cassiopeia doesn't use the additional stats as effectively. And a very common issue with Noxus throughout set 9 is how often the units are contested. So it can be very difficult to reroll for Cassiopeia, Neferi and Samira and then find the other units in the late game. But the biggest issue I find is that Swain is the only good holder of Morello on this board. But how do you decide which Cassiopeia reroll comp to play? Well, that depends on what you hit in the early game and after you roll down. Usually you will have a board like this in the early game and you play around and invest into what you manage to 3-star. For example, if you hit 3-star Cassiopeia, Renekton, Neferi and Samira, then you can play this board. And that's the same case for the other comps where you play around what you've rolled and what you've managed to 3-star. And generally with these comps, at level 9 you can either play Ryze or drop Darius for Mordekaiser and Aatrox. But as you continue at level 9, you should start looking to pivot into more legendary units like Ahri and Sion. So I've reiterated and emphasized several times that a Morello player is important in each comp. But why is that the case? Well, that's due to how Cassiopeia's ult works and how 30% of her damage is in the second ult rotation. So, an anti-heal applier is crucial for Cassiopeia, so she can instantly gain a 30% damage bonus and completely forego her first spell rotation, which tremendously increases her DPS. This is imperative if you want Cassiopeia to be a relevant carry in the late game. But why is it always Morello and never Sunfire? Well, Sunfire's anti-heal application is limited to a single unit within 2 hexes every 2 seconds. Whereas there are multiple units that can apply Morello to numerous units repeatedly like Swain, MF and Ashe. But an extra Sunfire isn't useless because these comps scale really hard with extra items since there are so many great tanks and carries. And Cassiopeia's spell rotations are also the reason why Frontline is so essential, as you will have time to get those rotations off. Anyway, Cassiopeia's itemization is extremely straightforward because you just want items that enable her single target damage. Of course, these items are Blue Buff, which immensely hastens her spell rotations, Jeweled Gauntlet, which enables crit and can amplify all of the AP Cassiopeia has, and finally, there's Giant Slayer, which further magnifies Cassiopeia's damage, especially against tanks that she may have gotten stuck on otherwise. But remember that Cassiopeia doesn't need any healing because of Shurima, and Hexa Gunblade is especially bad for her since she is single target. Anyway, in terms of tank items, I really like Bramble and Dragon's Claw due to how accessible crit has become in set 9, and you also get a bit of healing from Dragon's Claw. Warmog is especially great for Renekton 3 as he will increase the value of the item with both Bruiser and Shurima. And if there's a lot of burst, then you can make Redemption to keep your frontline alive. In terms of spatulas, a Shurima spat is far better than a Noxus spat since 6 Shurima is stronger than 5 Noxus. So if you get offered an augment for either spat, then the Shurima one is better. Speaking of, amazing augments I should specifically mention are Unburdened since a lot of your board may be unitemized, Know Your Enemy since it's a huge damage bonus that's quite easy to get for these comps, and augments that are always great are Jeweled Lotus and Red Buff. Jeweled Lotus makes your entire board deal significantly more damage, and you can forego Jeweled Gauntlet for another damage item. And Red Buff is the most reliable way to proc Cassiopeia's bonus damage. But generally, the itemizations, augments, and even portals are pretty standard, and there's nothing out of the ordinary as you just want to enable rerolling Cassiopeia and Shurima. And that should cover most of it. I think this video may just be one of the only Cassiopeia guides for this entire set, but hopefully now you may actually encounter Cassiopeia in the wild. But I'd like to ask you, should I continue making guides like this? I've noticed that a lot of TFT guides just tell you what comp to play and how to play it, but they don't tell you why they work. I've tried to take that extra step in this video, but is that even helpful to you? Please let me know because I'm not sure whether or not to cut or keep it in future guides. But yeah, what do you guys think about Cassiopeia reroll? Will you try it, and if you did, how did it go? Let me know in the comments and remember to subscribe. Anyway, check out these other videos if you want to see more from me, and as always, thank you for watching and I'll catch you in the next one.